Thank you for joining us on Heritage Events Live. We're delighted to welcome you to Policy Polls, Resistance and Hope in Afghanistan. Please welcome our host, Luke Coffey, Director of the Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy. We hope you enjoy the program.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us here today to talk about this very important topic of Afghanistan and what is happening in Afghanistan, especially as it pertains to this emergence of a resistance movement against the Taliban. Today, I'm very honored to be joined by Mr. Ali Nazary. Mr. Nazary is the head of foreign relations for the National Resistance Front of Afghanistan. He's become the public face of the resistance movement that is based in Panjshir, Afghanistan. And he, in fact, himself was able to get out of Kabul 3 days after the Taliban took the city. The purpose of today's conversation is to arm you with as many facts and with as much information as possible in a shorter 30-minute format for a public event. So again, thank you for tuning in to watch, and we will start the discussion right now. Thank you again, Mr. Nazary, for coming here today to speak with us. You left Afghanistan not too long ago. You have been involved at a very senior level in Afghan politics for more than a decade. You are still in contact with those who are in Panjshir. And as I said, you've become the public face for much of the international community for the resistance movement, for the NRF. Can you give our viewers a general overview or an assessment of what is currently happening in Panjshir Valley and in Afghanistan?
Thank you very, very much, Luke, for having me here today. It's an honor to be here at the Heritage Foundation. I was here a few years ago, and it's great to be back.
You're always welcome back.
Thank you. About giving an assessment on the situation in Afghanistan, unfortunately, it isn't as optimistic as we want it to be. Unfortunately, the Afghan states or Afghan nation has been hijacked by a terrorist group, by a drug cartel, by a criminal syndicate today, and they're being assisted by many foreign countries in the region, especially by one specific one. At the moment, the Taliban have taken most of the country. However, there's still hope, and there's hope for resistance. The resistance after August 15 started in Panjshir and in a neighboring district known as Andarab. It's in Baghlan province, and since then there has been an armed struggle against the Taliban. In the past few days, the Taliban have entered Panjshir Valley, but their entrance doesn't mean defeat. It was a tactical retreat, and right now we control more than 65%, around 60 to 65% of the province, because the more than 15 sub-valleys in Panjshir is controlled by the NRF.
Yeah, that's a very good point, actually. Yeah. Could you talk a little bit about the topography or the geography of the Panjshir? You know, why has it played this role throughout history of being the starting point of resistance movements, whether it was against the Soviets in the 80s or the Taliban in the 1990s?
So Panjshir has always been a natural fortress. And it didn't start 40, 50 years ago during the Cold War. For the past few hundred years, and you can even say millennia, it has served as a fortress, because when Alexander the Great invaded this region, he faced resistance in the same Hindu Kush valleys, especially Panjshir Valley. Genghis Khan and his army faced resistance, and many people from the cities took refuge in Panjshir, and they still have, many people in Panjshir have ancestry going back to Bukhara, Samarkand, Balkh, these great cities that fell, and they had to take refuge in Panjshir, and then they had the resistance. When the British invaded Afghanistan, they faced fierce resistance in this part of the country, and again, the Soviets, because it has a very unique topography, geography, where the main valley is like a tree trunk, and then you have numerous branches from the southernmost part of Panjshir to the northernmost part, and those sub-valleys have sub-valleys of themselves, so they branch out into other valleys. So controlling Panjshir, entering Panjshir, especially the main valley, it does not translate into victory for the invaders. It doesn't translate into defeat for the resistance fighters, for the freedom fighters. So for the past few days, our fighters have retreated to the sub-valleys. Many families have retreated to the sub-valleys. And the same situation happened during the struggle against the Soviets. The Soviets would enter the main valley inside Panjshir, hold on to the main road for a few days or a few weeks, and then a counteroffensive. What would happen from these strategic positions. So the Taliban's claim that they've become victorious, they've suppressed the resistance, is not true, and the NRF is still in control. Just yesterday, the head of our military committee, he recorded a video, and we put it up on social media and other media outlets. So it is continuing, and the people have the resilience and the will to continue their resistance. However, after the Taliban entered Panjshir, our leader, Commander Ahmad Massoud, the son of the late Ahmad Shah Massoud, he recorded a message to the nation, and it went viral. And just 2 hours after the message was aired on TV, on radio, the transcript was published in different websites and publications, people started their protests against the Taliban regime. Women and men in Kabul, Mazar, Herat, and Faizabad and Badakhshan and many other cities, they've been continuing their protests for days, and they've expressed their support for resistance, for freedom, for justice. And we've had small pockets of uprisings, armed uprisings in other parts of Afghanistan. So the resistance is growing because it enjoys the legitimacy today. The Taliban have the geography, they control most of the provinces, but that doesn't mean anything. It's a short-term game. What matters is what side has the legitimacy, what side has the hearts and minds of the people, and it's the resistance. Because with one call, we're able to mobilize the whole nation, or most of the nation, and our diaspora communities outside of Afghanistan. And right now, for the past week, we've seen numerous demonstrations here in the US and in the UK and European countries and the regional countries. So there is hope, even though right now the situation is bleak because you have most of the country being controlled by this group, and they are oppressing the people. But there's hope for a better future because of this resistance. And another point when it comes to Panjshir, right now, since the Taliban have entered the main valley, unfortunately, right now they're committing atrocities, war crimes. They're forcefully removing people, expelling people from the valley. They're committing ethnic cleansing. Yesterday on my social media platform, on Twitter, I put up a video where thousands of families are being removed, forcefully removed from their homes from the valley, and who knows where they will be located after they're removed from Panjshir. Second is mass killings. And we're getting more evidence now because people are leaving the valley, and they're handing over evidence of this, that young men have been rounded up from villages that are controlled by the Taliban, put on trucks, sent to undisclosed locations. Many people in the villages have been massacred, and I received many of the photos and videos today. So there is ethnic cleansing and genocide unfolding in that part of Afghanistan, unfortunately, without much international attention.
It's tragic, and there's really no excuse for this lack of international attention because unlike the 1980s, unlike the 1990s, we have social media.
Yes.
People have access to the information if they want to see it, and I'm not sure why people choose not to see it. Perhaps in the United States or in some Western countries, it's a shame the way we abandoned the people of Afghanistan, so we're just trying to ignore it. But it is puzzling, I have to admit, on why these atrocities can take place and there's still this silence. And watching some of the images of especially young women out protesting on the streets in Kabul and Jalalabad and Herat and other places, even with Taliban thugs with guns pointed at them, really shows how the society of Afghanistan has changed over the years. Can you talk a little bit about the makeup of the NRF? What sorts of people have made their way to Panjshir to join the resistance? Do they have military training? Are they more local? I think people are very interested in this side of things.
To make something clear, the NRF, the National Resistance Front of Afghanistan, isn't an ethnic movement. It isn't a sectarian movement. It's not even a regional movement. It's made up of different ethnic groups, different political groups from different ideologies. It's a group made up of people who share mutual values, which is democracy, rights and freedom, social justice, and rational Islam, and so forth. This is what has united people under this umbrella, not ethnicity, race, gender, religion, and so forth. So it's a very heterogeneous movement, but the military committee is made up of three components: the resistance fighters. One is the local resistance fighters that were trained in the Panjshir Valley in the past 2 years. The second component is the resistance fighters from the other provinces. And again, they're made up of different ethnic groups. We had people from Western Afghanistan, from the central provinces, from Bamiyan, Daikundi, from the northern provinces, even some from the south. And the third are the remnants of the former ANSF, the special forces, commandos that were highly trained, US trained. They've joined the fight against the Taliban, and they're still there. And they didn't flee like the president, or they didn't surrender like many of the commanders of the ANA. Many of the remnants of the National Police and remnants of the National Army is the third component. So it's made up of these three components, and there's thousands of fighters right now inside Panjshir in the neighboring districts that have the motivation and the morale to resist the Taliban and to liberate Afghanistan from this terrorist organization and its terrorist allies like Al-Qaeda and other affiliated groups. And to establish justice, equality, freedom, and rights for everyone, and to preserve democracy, because we believe that no other system could replace democracy in Afghanistan. We're past the era of having an emirate, having a monarchy, or any other autocratic regime. The only system in Afghanistan that will ensure the rights and freedoms of every single citizen is democracy.
And you just mentioned you said for the past 2 years the resistance in Panjshir has been preparing. That timeline, many observers will note, sort of coincides with the peace talks and the negotiations process between the U.S., the Taliban, and the Afghan government. Did your leader, Ahmad Shah Massoud, recognize some of the shortcomings early on with this peace process? Was he concerned that it wasn't going to deliver a just outcome to the fighting? Could you talk a little bit about these preparations that you mentioned? Because I don't think many people realize that this took place. Many people think all of a sudden Kabul fell and then all these people ran to Panjshir to start a resistance movement. But in fact, the roots grow a little deeper than just that.
So from the onset, our leader, Commander Ahmad Massoud, and the rest of us, we believe that the approach that was adopted by Ambassador Khalilzad was a flawed approach, that it would result into the catastrophe that unfolded in Afghanistan since August 15th. And we convey to Ambassador Khalilzad every time that we met him that the approach that you're pursuing is going to cause such a catastrophe. That it is not going to stabilize Afghanistan. It is not going to cause lasting peace in Afghanistan. It's going to embolden a terrorist group It is going to weaken the current democracy, the current republic that is in control of Afghanistan. It's going to weaken the morale of the national forces, the ANSF, and it will cause a disintegration of the state. However, he gave us different assurances that that will not happen. However, on August 15th, our predictions came true. And so beforehand, we believe that we should prepare ourselves. And when we approached our people, we went village to village, met the elders, we met the youth, we met women, men, in Panjshir and many other provinces, met scholars, we met the local commanders, everyone, and officials inside the government. Everyone said, we see Afghanistan's future in a pessimistic way, and we believe we see Afghanistan's future very bleak. So we have to prepare ourselves. So exactly 2 years ago, on September 5th, 2019, more than 30,000 people gathered at the mausoleum of the late Commander Ahmad Shah Massoud.
Which has since been destroyed.
Yes.
By the Taliban.
The Taliban have desecrated his grave, unfortunately, and this is a great insult to the Afghan nation, disrespecting Afghanistan's national hero, and this has created reaction throughout Afghanistan. So 30,000 people gathered there, and they declared Ahmad Massoud as the successor of his father, and told him to prepare yourself. And people from throughout Afghanistan came, and the speakers were from different ethnic groups, representatives of different political groups, political forces, and ethnic groups, and all of them said, it's time for you to step up, take the torch, and start mobilizing our people. So since September 2019, we've started our efforts. We started our efforts because we knew that we would face such a catastrophe that we're facing today.
Yeah. And how would you describe the short-term goals of the NRF and perhaps the more longer-term goals? Right now, the situation, at least from an outside perspective, seems desperate. However, there have been many examples of resistance movements throughout history that started out in a very desperate situation. I mean, almost by definition, a resistance movement has to be in a desperate situation to become a resistance movement. So even with things being bleak right now, but there's hope for the future, what are the short-term and then longer-term goals for the NRF?
The short-term goal is to sustain a resistance in Afghanistan and to expand resistance, whether it's through an armed uprising, armed resistance in different regions of the country, reviving the local resistance that existed in many parts of the country before August 15th, and even of encouraging people in the cities to rise up. Either peaceful means, how the women are demonstrating today, protesting today for their rights and freedom, and for them to start speaking out. Because if we do not speak out at this juncture, we will allow this terrorist organization to consolidate power, and it will be very difficult in the future. One, in the short term, when it comes to our politics outside of Afghanistan, to prevent the international community from giving recognition, legitimacy to this criminal syndicate. They'll have a negative impact, not only for the people of Afghanistan for the decades to come, but for the region and the rest of the world. Having terrorists enjoy legitimacy, having a seat in the UN, having embassies in the Western world, and at the same time having strong ties with Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups, emboldening them that they could use the same precedent, the same example as what happened in Afghanistan, to force their enemies, to force the Western countries, whoever they are fighting, to the negotiating table, and to force them to give concessions and to negotiate with them and legitimize them. So in the short term, that has to be prevented, and for the democratic government coming out of the National Resistance Front, which is a continuation of that republic that existed, to receive the legitimacy, to keep the legitimacy. as the legitimate, internationally recognized government of Afghanistan. Something that happened in the 1990s. We didn't control much territory in the 1990s as well. However, we were the internationally recognized government. We were the representatives of Afghanistan because we enjoy the legitimacy. The people support us. We have the hearts and minds of the people. So this is a decision that the international community has to make. They're either going to recognize a terrorist organization, a drug cartel as Afghanistan's government, or they are going to support the will of the people of Afghanistan, which is the continuation of a democratic government, inclusive government made up of different ethnic and sectarian groups representing everyone in Afghanistan.
It is extraordinary to think that we even have to have this discussion. The so-called caretaker government that the Taliban announced earlier this week contains 13 members that are under United Nations sanctions, right? So how could the international community even contemplate giving legitimacy or recognizing such a so-called government when a majority are under international sanctions? I mean, even the new interior minister is wanted by the FBI for $5 million.
Yes.
And yet we still have to have this discussion here today about whether or not the U.S. or the international community is going to recognize the Taliban. For me, the answer seems pretty straightforward. Speaking of the international community and the United States, what are practical things, or what are things that the average American can do? What are things that the Congress can do? What are things that the administration can do to help not only the people of Afghanistan, but also the National Resistance Front? You already mentioned, I think, which is probably the most immediate and an important one, which is not to recognize the Taliban. But are there other humanitarian concerns? Do you, for example, need other supplies, cold weather gear, equipment, military hardware, communications hardware? I understand that the communications in the Panjshir Valley have been cut. So practical things, what can the United States do?
So our ask from the international community, from all our allies, is to take Afghanistan into consideration, because the conflict right now in Afghanistan is in a civil war. We don't consider our struggle as being part of a civil war and internal warfare between different political forces inside Afghanistan. Our struggle is against transnational terrorism. We're fighting transnational terrorism today in Afghanistan. During the last operation, which the Taliban did enter Panjshir, there were more than 500 Arab fighters assisting them. So we were fighting Al-Qaeda, we were fighting elements, individuals, terrorists that came from Iraq and Syria and elsewhere.
And you have posted videos on social media, correct?
Yes.
Showing Arab-speaking fighters heading to Panjshir, saying they're going to Panjshir to fight.
So this is a global struggle, and unfortunately, we're fighting the war on terror today, continuing the war on terror, all alone, abandoned, without receiving any sort of assistance, even humanitarian assistance. And we see that if the last remaining Western ally, the last remaining forces that are against terrorism in Afghanistan, if they're not supported, then there won't be an ally in the future, if needed, to fight terrorism. The Taliban are never going to combat terrorism. The Taliban itself is a terrorist organization. They share an ideology with Al-Qaeda and ISIS. There is no difference between them. It's just the color of their flags are different. One day, a Taliban soldier hoists a white flag, another day a black flag. But at the end of the day, their objectives are the same, their ideology is the same. Their source of legitimacy is the same. And right now, as you mentioned, in their so-called cabinet, you have designated terrorists. And these designated terrorists have strong ties with both Al-Qaeda and ISIS. You mentioned the so-called interior minister. He has strong ties with ISIS at the moment and with Al-Qaeda. Their chief of staff is someone called Fasihuddin. He's from Badakhshan, from a valley called Warduj. Warduj Valley right now has had hundreds of foreign fighters, terrorist fighters from elsewhere for the past 5 years. It's very strategic, that valley, and Fasihuddin has been hosting them there. They're affiliated with Al-Qaeda. So it's a government, it's a so-called government regime that doesn't represent Afghanistan's people. It doesn't represent the vast majority of Afghanistan's people. And it represents terrorism, international terrorism, the interests of transnational terrorism today. And the international community, especially the Western world, is ignoring this reality. And if it ignores this, unfortunately, we are at the eve of 9/11 today. The day after tomorrow is 9/11. Actually, tomorrow is 9/11. And unfortunately, today, Al-Qaeda and international terrorism is much stronger than September 11th, 2001. They're more emboldened. They have an example of bringing the United States to a negotiating table, receiving concessions from the United States, receiving recognition and legitimacy. And this has emboldened them, this has strengthened them. They have the stamina, they have the will, motivation to create a haven, a base from Afghanistan, and to start launching attacks on US and Western assets in the region, and ultimately to repeat or even to plan attacks much worse than 9/11.
Yeah.
So this is very concerning for us. Not only should it be concerning for the people of Afghanistan, for the National Resistance Front, for all the freedom fighters of Afghanistan, freedom-loving people of Afghanistan, but it should be a concern for everyone in the Western world, everyone throughout the globe.
No, absolutely. And, it is a sad twist and geopolitical irony that on the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, the Taliban will actually control more of Afghanistan than it did on September 11th, 2001. But there is still that glimmer of hope, mainly led by the NRF, that it doesn't always have to be this way. And if history is anything to go by, then God willing, the NRF will have success over the medium and long term, and the people of Afghanistan will someday be able to escape from the shackles of the Taliban. Mr. Nazary, I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedule to come here today and to speak with us here at the Heritage Foundation. I want to thank our viewers for taking the time to watch today. This will be posted online to watch in the future, so please share it with your friends and on social media. You will also receive an email with a survey asking about your thoughts of today's event and how you would like to see future events take place going ahead in the future. So again, thank you, and many Americans are watching this very closely. We're praying for the people of Afghanistan, and we wish you and your countrymen all the good luck and success.
It's an honor being here today, and thank you once more.
Thank you.
Thank you.